To begin with, we're going to invite each one of the 4 first-term legislators up to give you a 3-minute, and the clock will be running, capsule of their entire political life and the 1989 session. And I think we'll begin with Representative Beverly Stein. And if I might read something about Beverly, I quote, "She is a self-admitted socialist. She is single. She is vocal about her four-square support of omnibus homosexual minority status bills in the Oregon Legislature, and she is a radical feminist." Or so claims the Oregon Citizens Alliance, whose newsletter I am reading from there. Despite what the Oregon Citizens Alliance tells you, I found Beverly Stein to be one of the more courageous first-term legislators in Salem. There are what Representative Peter Courtney calls body bag issues in Salem. They are the ones you want to avoid at all costs. And I never noted Beverly avoiding any of them. She was always in the thick of those really emotional, often mean-spirited fights. So first, Representative Beverly Stein from the City of Portland.
Thank you, Steve. In the records of the session, there are 1,100 bills that were passed by the House and the Senate, and only 14 bills which were listed as failing. Floor votes on controversial issues in the legislature are avoided like the plague, especially if the issue is controversial in your caucus. I was asked to relate an anecdote that illustrated something I learned in the legislature during my first session. And what I've chosen to reflect on is the effect of my advocacy on a very controversial issue and the relationships in my Democratic caucus. I wish I could tell you what happened in the Republican caucus on this issue. I often wanted to be a fly on the wall of that room, but science hasn't advanced quite that far yet. The bill I'm speaking about added sexual orientation to the law which forbids intimidation due to a person's race, religion, or national origin. During the last few days of the session, when the possibility of bringing this bill to the floor was brought up, I made the rounds of people in my caucus who I thought would support adding gays to the intimidation bill, but were people who I also knew would be nervous about making a politically difficult vote. I got, I think, a predictable response and a pained look from some. "I'd probably vote yes, Beverly, but please don't make me do it." This brought me and my partners in this effort, Vera Katz and Judy Bauman, to a very difficult decision point. I think we all wavered at times on the advisability of going forward. The relationships among the members of the caucus is a very delicate one. You need each other, and the alliances shift, sometimes hour to hour. And you don't know what the far-reaching and unknown ramifications might be from various alliances you might make. To force a vote in the caucus on such a politically charged issue really put our credibility and goodwill on the line, especially when the common sense was that this bill absolutely had no chance of passing in the House. In fact, Senator Jim Hill, during the floor debate on this bill, said it would be an absolute miracle if the bill passed in the House. Because of the controversy, the bill came to the House. Before the bill would come to the House, we caucused to decide if, in fact, we should allow it to come over from the Senate, where we knew it would pass. This is a highly unusual caucus topic, but was necessary for this kind of bill. I argued that the state needed to go on record against gay bashing, which is often associated with skinhead activity, and say that this was totally unacceptable in our society. Although 16 members of the caucus agreed and voted to bring the bill over, I think it's safe to say that many caucus members were not exactly overjoyed at the prospect. We caucused one more time on this bill when a motion to table was offered at the opening of debate. During the caucus meeting at that time, we could only confirm 24 yes votes. During that caucus, I insisted that we could win, although our vote count was 8 short. I think a little nervy on my part. I said that the floor debate would do the trick. One thing I learned, that if you're pursuing a very controversial issue, You can't let up. You can't give anyone the smallest excuse for getting out of the hard vote that may be coming. As I left the caucus, one of the senior members put his hands on my shoulders and he said, "Beverly, the debate on the floor never makes a difference." Generally, he was right, and actually that was one of the surprising things I learned in the legislature. But in this case, this is one of the few times during the session when it actually did make a difference. After a very emotional and personal debate, the votes flashed up on the screen, and we had 31 votes. I'm very glad we did it, especially since we won. And I hope that the people that voted with us will win again next time and be prepared to make hard votes again in the future. An important lesson I learned is that sometimes you have to take a very important risk. Risk your relationship with your caucus members and risk your credibility and just go for it. That you can't always be cautious. That sometimes the gains you will gain from that risk are worth it. With the intimidation bill, we did risk a lot and we won a lot. The state is now on record that we will not tolerate bigotry in any form. Thank you.
The next legislator that we're going to call up here is Cedar Hills raised and Yale educated, which I think says something wonderful about America. After leaving Yale, Phil was involved in a truly, honorable, dishonorable, I don't know which. He was a journalist for quite a while. And part of his journalism career occurred at the Washington Monthly in Washington, D.C., where Phil worked approximately 70 hours a week for $700 a month. Now, the Washington Monthly is the liberal magazine that challenges liberal orthodoxy. I think you all would find it quite challenging. It insists on saying something bad occasionally about the good guys and something good occasionally about the bad guys. And I think Phil has brought that perspective to his first session. One of his most famous pieces at the Washington Monthly was an indictment of the American educational system. In fact, that piece won him a seat on a Donahue show. Of course, this was before Donahue sold his soul to Geraldo Rivera. Representative Phil Keisling, a Democrat from the city of Portland.
Thank you, Steve. I do confess to being a former card-carrying member of the Fourth Estate. One reason I left journalism for a while to pursue politics is though it was very satisfying as a career. You got to go around and write stories a lot about how stupid politicians were about their decisions. As a colleague once told me, he says, "You know what we do, Phil? We journalists go in after the battle's all been fought and we walk around and we shoot the wounded." And wanted to see what it was like trying to get from here to there and whether you could get from here to there. And I want to talk real briefly about some of the work I did in the area of the environment and some lessons that I learned there about getting from here to there. And two lessons particularly, one about when consensus building works and when what I might call consensomania is a waste of everybody's time. The first category, I was heavily involved in a bill called the Toxic Use Reduction Program. A bill that I think is a landmark, puts Oregon on the map nationally as the first state that has adopted a formal planning process for companies to set performance goals, make annual progress reports about reducing the use of toxic chemicals in the first place. Now, consensus building usually works when you have people involved early, when people are personally invested in a result, and probably most importantly, when people on various sides can see a common goal. Now, in this bill, Osberg brought the bill, but the business and industry clearly had an enlightened self-interest, I'd call it, in having a bill pass. It would reduce the disposal costs of hazardous waste, reduce their legal liability, their workers' compensation claims, and I think they also wanted to avoid the prospect of an initiative petition on the ballot that they'd have to fight. It still took a long time. It took 2 months of sitting down in lengthy meetings in very hard wooden chairs. a lot of frustration, some serendipity. I remember at one point some key provisions were worked out over beer, a TV set, and the NCAA finals. And I assume they were rooting for the same team because they didn't come to the agreement held. And finally we hammered out a bill that wasn't just mush, everyone was enthusiastic. And then I learned a corollary of the process, which is what they don't know can undo a lot of hard work. And the they I refer to here is the Ways and Means Committee. Those of you who know the legislature know that policy committees will often work out the details of a bill, and if it has a fiscal impact, it goes to Ways and Means. And many of whose members never worked on the bill and didn't know about all the fragile deals you'd made to put it all together. Remember, a month later, a business lobbyist came up to me. He was frantic. He said a member of the committee wants to delete this critical portion of the bill, thinking that it's going to help a company in the home district. And he scurried around, got the company to call the member. The member was convinced, okay, I won't push for that, and we all breathed a sigh of relief. And an hour later, we learned the member was now pushing to abolish the bill completely. It reminded some of us of a Bob Marley song, the reggae artist, who one of his lyrics was that some people have their hopes and dreams and some people got their ways and means. Real briefly, an example of consensomania involved a bill that was called the Indoor Clean Air Act. It was a mild version of the ballot measure 6, which had failed after one of the most expensive campaigns in history. We knew that even this mild version didn't have much of a chance, but there were some important aspects of trying to clean up indoor clean air. So I was enlisted. It wasn't my bill. I volunteered for it to sit down in a room and do the same thing, try to hammer something out. And we had about 4 or 5 meetings, and we kept doing this and agreeing to this, and basically it was taking things out that people in the tobacco industry didn't like. And twice I thought we had an agreement, and twice it disappeared when people from the tobacco industry went back and talked to their lobbyists on the national level. When we finally got the bill to the floor, it was so watered down, some of us were embarrassed about advocating it, but we did. It passed. The Senate then took it up and added just a few grains of salt to this pretty thin soup. By this time, when it came back to the House, the lobbyists were out in force. They got everybody involved, business, the labor unions, and it went down 20 to 40. It was trounced. One of the worst defeats of the whole session. It was a bill that didn't do very much except do a study. So we went to conference committee and took out all the Senate language, and then I went and started counting votes on the floor, and even though the bill was identical to what we passed before, now people were not going to vote for it because the lobbyists were out. And I had given up. I'd learned my first hard lesson as a freshman, which is that you can do a lot of work and try to build consensus, and if people don't have an interest in any bill, and I think this is the case, it can all go for naught. That was where we were the day before the session. I was resigned not even to bring it up and force the embarrassment of voting it down again, and someone came up to me and said, you know, Phil, congratulations, your bill just passed the Senate, it's on the way to the governor. And I was stunned, and I learned the corollary, which is what they don't know and what you don't know can be a blessing in disguise. There's a little-known House rule that says that if the bill passes in its original form, the Senate amendments, but then you take out all the Senate amendments, you don't have to pass the same bill twice. And I went outside to the lobby area where everyone had been pulling members out frantically, telling them to vote against the bill. And I went up to the tobacco lobbyist about it and kind of smiled, and he goes, well, you know, we just spent 3 hours lobbying the wrong house. and he had to laugh, too, about it. And you realize in this game you do have to laugh even though you're on opposing sides. And he especially had to laugh. He's a little embarrassed. Turns out he'd been in the legislature himself for 3 terms, and he didn't know about the rule either. Thank you very much.
I do want to remind everyone that definitely with a preference towards City Club members, we will allow you to come back and ask questions about anything you hear in these opening statements, so to speak. Our next representative is the lone Republican at the front table, though everyone agrees that Tom Bryan is in a state of transition. Kelly Clark trained under Senator Mark Hatfield for several months. I think that was before he went to law school. The second column I wrote as a political columnist at the Oregonian was a column in which I had Kelly Clark instructing Senator Bob Packwood on how to heal the rift between the moderates and the conservatives in the Republican Party. and Senator Packwood has never forgotten Kelly's advice nor forgiven him for offering it. From West Lynn, Representative Kelly Clark.
Thank you, Steve. I am the only Republican up here this morning, this afternoon. Tom was in transition, as you mentioned. They took a poll the other day, however, of the Washington County Republican delegation. They decided Tom's too conservative for them, so he can't. He'll have to move if he's going to join another Republican caucus. And you may think that there are no differences really anymore between Republicans and Democrats. I've got a whole arm list full of them, but I'll just give you a couple of the differences. Democrats buy most of the books that have been banned somewhere. Republicans just form censorship committees and read them as a group. Republicans tend to keep their shades drawn, although there's seldom any reason why they should. Democrats ought to, but don't. And finally, Republican boys date Democratic girls. They plan to marry Republican girls, but they just feel like they're entitled to a little fun first. My wife, who is sitting right here, by the way, was a Democrat when I married her. She's now a Republican. I don't know what that says. I've been asked to speak a little bit about sentencing guidelines in the legislature and the role that I played as a member of House Judiciary Committee on sentencing guidelines. And it was one of the few issues that I decided to sit back and wait on and try and sink my teeth into from a policy perspective. I made a decision to try and pick and choose my battles rather carefully, recognizing that the legislative process was going to be very, very hectic and you wouldn't be able to be expert on everything. Sentencing guidelines, for those of you who may not know, is a fundamental change in the way we send people to prison or don't send people to prison in this state. Basically going to take a lot of the discretion away from the judges and, more importantly, from the parole board. And the legislature was going to make a truth in sentencing determination as to what kind of time these people are actually going to serve. So instead of telling an eighth-time burglar that he or she was going to go to prison for 20 years and, in fact, have he or she be there for 6 weeks, the 87 legislature made a determination that we were going to go to a truth in sentencing package, figure out how much prison space you had, create a panel of certified smart people headed by Dave Frohnmeyer and Hardy Myers, and let them come up with a grid system that would do that. Now, the trade-off is you take criminal history, a person's criminal history along one axis, and the crime seriousness scale along another, and where those two lines meet, there's a number in there, and maybe it's 40 months, maybe it's 80 months, but that's the time that that person will serve. The parole board is abolished or phased out, temporary leave is abolished and phased out, and the idea is that we'll get a better sense of what people are actually going to serve. The trade-off, however, is that you draw a dispositional line halfway down the grid, and everybody underneath that, we're not even going to pretend that they're going to prison. So there was some politics wrapped up in this because you could arguably say that we were lightening sentences for some people. That made a lot of people nervous, especially people in my caucus in the House. One other thing you need to know about sentencing guidelines is you need to remember that almost 1/3 of the House members were freshmen or first-term legislators. And fully half of the Judiciary Committee were first-term legislators. And the Judiciary Committee was nothing if not anxious to get tough on crime. They called us the John Wayne Committee, and Peter Courtney's standing advice to Tom Mason was, Mr. Chair, don't mess with the committee. One of the provisions in the 1987 legislation that controlled the agenda this session was a provision that said the sentencing guidelines would go into effect automatically in the fall of this year unless they were repealed by the legislature. That was not popular in our caucus, who felt like that, particularly among the first-term legislators, who felt like we needed to understand these things, we needed to review them, and we needed to pass on them. And so I took it on myself, along with Representative Ted Calori, to try and learn these things top to bottom, which was difficult to do in the midst of a legislative session because we were working evenings from 9 till 11 o'clock, mornings from 6 till 8 o'clock, and Sunday nights to try. It was about the only time that we had. By the time the main sentencing guidelines bill came to House Judiciary, we had prepared something in excess of 25 amendments for the main sentencing guidelines bill, most of them having substantial prison bed impact on the system. We worked our way through 3 or 4 days of intense hearings towards the end of the session when things were hectic anyway, and I was feeling fairly good about the product that we had come up with, and in fact was putting my notebook together, getting ready to leave, and Representative John Minnis said, Mr. Chair, I have just one more amendment. And he pulled out a 75-page document which consisted of 10 anti-crime House bills that had passed the House and were sitting in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he attached those as a friendly amendment, so to speak, to this sentencing guidelines package. Fireworks exploded, and 3 days later, we discovered that the Senate had no intentions of concurring in that, and so the whole thing was thrown to a conference committee. This was all winding down the last few days of the session. We were running back and forth, literally running back and forth between the conference committee and the floor as we're being called to vote. Very difficult to get much sense for what was actually happening from the standpoint of policy. And we were, the House members were up against Senator Joyce Cohen, who had her own opinions about some of the things that we had done. And Senator Cohen is tough and smart and was not about to yield on a couple of points. We ended up in classic compromise, and I felt fairly good about the package that we ended up with. The question all through the legislature was, are sentencing guidelines a management tool for whatever prison beds the legislature decides we need, or are they an excuse not to build prisons? And that was the suspicion running through the Republican caucus all through the session. I got advice time and time again was you can't work with the majority party, that you will end up getting stabbed in the back. We should just tube these things. We should just have an early floor vote and kill them, and don't try to work them, don't try and improve them. Dave Frohnmeyer, Ted Calori, and some others convinced me that that wasn't necessarily the case if you did it the right way. And as I was sitting there in conference with Ted Calori I think it was 2-3 days before the session was over, and I had been getting notes from senators saying it's time to go home, sign the Sentencing Guidelines Conference Committee report, and let's go. And I had my back up against the wall and was convinced that there was one last something that we needed. It was sort of a matter of principle for me, and we really needed it. And Marla Ray from Dave Frohnmeyer's office was in on the conference, and she's a character. And they kept saying, well, why do you think this is so important? And I kept trying to explain. And finally, Marla said, Kelly, declare victory and go home. And so that's what we did, and we ended up with a better package than was brought to us. We didn't get everything we want, but I suppose the moral of the story is in the legislative process, you never do. Thank you.
You know, when about a month before the session ended, I went up and spoke with Representative Greg Walden about the spirit of camaraderie, whatever, among the class of '89. And Greg told me that we did not come here to be anarchists. We came here to work together. And I think Tom Bryan is a great example of that. While the more senior legislators were fighting in the aisles, Tom was organizing the first bipartisan Bowl-O-Rama. In which all the first-term legislators went bowling together. Tom was mayor of Portland, mayor of Tigard. Don't I wish, never mind. He was also a member of the Tigard City Council for 10 years. He is a Democrat in a heavily Republican district, which is why when he was invited to participate in some of the delightful mailing games that the House Democratic Caucus and the Democratic Party of Oregon were participating in, he declined because he did not want to have Democratic Party of Oregon on his campaign literature. This is Tom's 41st birthday. Representative Tom Bryan from Tigard.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here, and I was surprised about how many friendly and familiar faces I saw when I came in, and it's a pleasure to be here again. I was asked to speak about the Transportation 2000 package. I don't think it has nearly the drama of the examples you've been given today, but I think it's nonetheless an important package, and it went through an interesting process. It's a good example of when an overwhelmingly documented need runs headlong into the politicians' against the most basic instincts, and that is to raise taxes. The Transportation 2000 Committee, which was comprised of business and government leaders from the metropolitan area, worked with the professionals in the transportation departments, came up with a package of about 7 bills to enhance the transportation system of the metropolitan area and the rest of the state. I served on the Transportation Committee, and it came to that committee. And it was kind of an interesting process. First you have the cities, the county, and the state that first have to agree on how much they're going to go after in terms of increases in gas tax and vehicle registration. They have to work with the governor's office to see what interest there might be there. And then there are other players, the Oregon Trucking Association, the Automobile Club, or it's the AAA group, And we got the city, county, and state going in the same direction in terms of percentages and percentages of splits. Then it came to the Transportation Committee, and it ran into the Oregon Trucking Association and AAA, who both were quite nervous about the package, both taking responsible positions to improve the transportation system, but both really not wanting any more taxes either. And then the issue came up of equality or equity of taxation between trucking and automobiles, and that was a very finely balanced process that this bill could affect dramatically, and especially since those of us on the Transportation Committee felt that, or at least the majority of us felt, that the Trucking Association or industry had just undergone a substantial change in the weight mile tax calculations, as well as the power unit registration methodology, which I won't bore you with today, but very substantial changes, kind of a roll of the dice for them to see how it might impact their industry. So we basically set out a proposal that would increase the gas tax but hold the trucking industry harmless for 1 year, which then threw this accountability measure out of whack a bit, and garnered the AAA's opposition to the entire package throughout the rest of the session. But it also, raising gas taxes and vehicle registration, not a comfortable thing to do, and the only way it got out of our committee was on a 4-3 vote with no recommendation. Typically votes get out, vote do pass. So we could not get it out of committee with a do pass recommendation. It had subsequent referral to revenue, which was a lot better than, you had comments about Ways and Means. One of the other names for Ways and Means is the Get Down on Your Knees and Beg Like a Dog Committee. And we were fortunate that it didn't go there. Went to revenue, where it was handled nicely and did come out to the floor, and all 7 measures passed on the House floor, although narrowly. And it took a lot of work on a lot of people's parts. Went over to the Senate. One of the bills failed on the Senate floor. It's the tire and battery tax, which was the one that I think most people questioned even on the House, but wanted to get it out. And so 6 of the 7 passed. So your gas tax will go up another 2 cents. Your vehicle registration will go up $5 per year over what it is, currently $10 per year. But for those of us in the metropolitan area, I feel it's going to meet or help address an incredible transportation need that isn't going to go away. And we just had to bite the bullet and do it. No one else is going to fix these roads. So, not dramatic. That was the balancing process of the transportation system. And I think I'll stop there, and the more dramatic things may come out in questions. Thank you.
We're now at the stage of the program where questions from the audience will be taken. If you let us down in terms of our expectations, I will have to ask questions of the legislators. But I assume that you've gotten some sense in the last 15 or 20 minutes of how complicated, harrowing, inexplicable, and sometimes emotionally devastating the whole process of politics and making good policy can be. Again, there will be a preference for City Club members at the microphones. I can take written questions, but if there are people out in the audience, I will be reluctant to open them. And since no one is available yet, I will direct a question to Representative Stein to begin with. We will probably keep the questions very short and brief, and I will ask the representatives to keep their answers as succinct as possible. I hate to open this can of worms, but Representative Stein, is there a middle ground in the abortion fray, and how many people will be looking for it in the next 16 months? How many legislators, lobbyists, whatever, between now and the next election?
Well, my belief on the abortion issue is that the people of Oregon and the majority of people believe that women have the intelligence to make a decision about when they are ready to be parents. I think we've seen the difficulties we get into when we don't honor that. In working in the human services area that I've worked in during the legislative session, I've seen the devastation to our society and to children and families from on children. I think the middle ground, if there is any middle ground, is to increase the funding for child care, to increase the funding for prenatal care, and to assure that all the children that are born are adequately taken care of.
A question from the floor.
Thank you, Steve. Stan Baumhofer, Director of Oregon Tax Research. I didn't mean to rush up here to be the first one. I just wanted to beat Ray Polani here. And Steve, I guess I need your approval to ask my question, because you said we could ask questions about anything we heard here today. And again today, I heard nothing about one of the major things that the legislature should have addressed, and that is how much money that we're spending. May I ask that question?
Sure.
My question should go to all of the panel, and I'd appreciate them each individually giving an answer.
I think I will ask you to direct your question just to one legislator, please. For the sake of brevity. Pick your favorite.
I would permit them to have a caucus before they answer. I guess Phil Keisling then. Yes. There's a lot of talk about the spending level of government. And my question, Phil, is why shouldn't the level of government spending be tied to our personal income level? Is it, as taxpayers, that we're asking for so many more services now, or different delivery of services, that there's some justification for the more rapid growth of state government than our ability to pay for it? Or is there some other answer as to why government needs to grow so much faster than personal income?
The issue of the spending limit, of course, was a very contentious one, and Mr. Baumhofer and I had chance that he was appeared as a witness for the Revenue Committee, of which I was a member several times. So a couple of things I think are real important to understand about that question. The first is on what basis and what base year do you use? If you look back over the last 10-year periods prior to this session, and you said let's tie the state general fund spending to personal income, you would have realized that it's gone down substantially since 1979, because you have the ratchet effect as the way the current spending limit works. And a lot of legislators didn't even understand how the spending limit worked, much less general members of the public. If you don't spend, you lose the ability to spend to the next biennium. I think Stan appreciates that and knows that. For every dollar that Oregonians earn, a nickel of it goes to the general fund. Of that nickel, about 2 cents of it goes back directly to people in the form of transfer payments, property tax relief, basic school support, aid to community colleges, etc. We have to grapple with at what point do we spend, at what level do we use our resources. And I actually agree that it ought to be tied to personal income as opposed to reaching back as many as 4 years and just tying it to what we were somehow able to come up with in a previous year and then ratchet it down and form a new base, have a constant. We worked on that. We failed to even get that general approach. We also knew that even if we had the general approach, there would be disagreement. Should it be 7%? Should it be 5%? We ended up spending about 5.8 or 5.9% of Oregonians' personal income is reflected in our general fund spending. Now, is that too high? Should it be 5.4% or should it be 6.2%? Clearly, there were some needs, very pressing needs, everything from human resources to education. The political process is one that I think voters in 1990 who are concerned about that are going to ask, regardless of whether you, quote, broke or went outside a statutory limit, is that the level that was adequate or not? And that's for them to decide. I thought we did a pretty responsible job about it, though we did grow more than in the previous biennium. I think the level we have now is actually lower than what it was a decade ago, and if anything, the challenges are greater. We've got a federal government abdicating responsibility in many areas, and we have the kinds of challenges on an international economic standpoint that make it imperative that government does what it has to do well.
I'd be willing to have a minority report if you care.
Ms. Remington.
Stevie Remington, member of the club. I have a question for Representative Stein, which is a follow-up on your first one. I would like your thoughts about the impact of the Webster decision and allowing much more latitude on the part of the state legislature to decide on restrictions on abortion. And I'm thinking in terms of the polarization, what it's going to do to electoral campaigns, the composition of the legislature, and what single issue voters how they somehow distort the general process.
Okay, it's a lot of questions in there. Well, I think that with the abortion issue and the redistricting of the legislature that will be coming up next time, this next campaign season will be extremely intense. And I think those issues are very much at the forefront, especially in terms of control of the legislature. In terms of what will happen in the legislature around the abortion issue and what kinds of polarization will occur there, a lot depends on who controls the legislature. And I certainly hope it will be Democrats that control, and we're very close to a margin there. So I think that will be part of the fight that will go on. I think that one of the reasons I was pleased that we were able to vote on the intimidation bill is we had the experience of people voting on hard issues. Now I hope those people come back and aren't damaged by that vote, so they'll be prepared to vote on hard issues again, because there are going to be some very difficult issues for us to face in the next session.
I'm going to interrupt just for a moment with a question for Representative Clark. Kelly, in the terms of the cost, the amount of money spent during the general election, you spent $105,000, which was in the entire legislature number 4 together overall and number 1 among House members. In terms of post-election indebtedness, you ended the election after you were elected, you were $36,000 in the hole, in the red. So it seems to me you might be the perfect guy to ask about the need for campaign finance reform. And if you might also enlighten us as to why nothing was done in this legislative session past.
Not till I get the debt paid off, okay? It was actually, if you figure a primary in there as well, it was more expensive than that, and my opponent spent almost as much money as well. And I don't think either she or I probably slept very well at night thinking about that. There was a couple of different proposals flying around the legislature about campaign finance reform. And one of the things that I noticed during the session was that anything that had to do with the political process per se, whether it was election reform, campaign finance reform, vote by mail, anything at all touching our turf, tended to generate, and I clocked a couple of debates, tended to generate 2 to 3 times the amount of debate on the floor as some other issues. I mean, we would slam dunk a small business issue with an hour of floor debate and spend 2.5 hours on a fairly minor piece of election reform. And I think that that's because people in the legislature know a lot about elections and a lot about campaigns, and they sort of feel protective of that. So I think that the idea of a campaign finance reform bill, a serious campaign finance reform bill, getting through the legislature, it seems to me to be a little bit naive. There's too many people with too many interests in being able to raise large amounts of money. I did support the proposal that came to the House floor, and I was criticized by some folks for doing that, saying it sort of ill behooves you, having raised that kind of money, now to stand up and talk about campaign finance reform. And so I said on the House floor, okay, don't consider me an advocate, consider me as Exhibit A. But I do think that the general public thinks that sort of a race is not necessary. When I started off, I would have never dreamed of spending $125,000 or $135,000. I think we had a $60,000 budget when it began, and certainly never dreamed of being $30,000 in debt. So, but I do think that in terms of something happening, it will have to happen via an initiative process, because I simply don't think that that there's the institutional will. It's not that individual legislators wouldn't be willing to see that happen. It's something that happens when you put us all together under the roof. The institutional will sort of fails.
Question from the floor.
I'm Ray Polani, a member of the City Club. You know, folks, you laugh and we all together laugh, but it's really our money. And my question is, given the funding scarcity and the adverse impacts and the action of the last legislature, when in your thinking, and I'm addressing really all the four freshmen there, freshmen, freshwomen, when in your thinking will the legislature and the voters, I guess, consider transportation funding as more than just more money for more and wider highways?
Well, I guess if the question is why don't we spend some money on transit instead of more and wider highways, I think we in fact did consider did increase some financing for those. The tire and battery tax is one that failed to help. That bill failed. It would have helped. I think there's a strong interest on the part of the Department of Transportation to work with the metro area on light rail and other alternatives to highways. But I think the consensus that I've seen in the metropolitan area is we need highways too. The thought that light rail will take care of all of our needs just isn't true. And we need both, and we need both badly. So there's a limit as to what the legislature can do. Theoretically, I'm sure they could dump 50 or 100 or 200 million into the metro area for light rail or other alternatives, but we're not the only legislators in the state. There are a lot of people downstate that think the metropolitan area gets too much as it is and so forth. So you've got to find a balance. I think when the time comes for direct match on a light rail federal grant, if after a good faith effort the metropolitan area cannot generate it locally, I'd be happy to support trying to get some money out of the legislature to help with that, because I think it's good for the whole state.
The problem is that meanwhile you voted for $64 additional million per year for highways and none for either light rail or heavy rail or whatever else.
You've got to get 31 and 16 votes.
Can I add something real briefly? I had the dubious privilege of having to carry the tire and battery fee bill on the floor. As a freshman member of the Revenue Committee, I was given the one that people thought would get creamed on the floor. A lot of lobbying went into that, and Ray, if there's a glimmer of hope in this, you had some legislators from downstate areas that did not have a self-interest in mass transit who voted yes on a very, very tough vote. I think of people like Sam Dominic of Cottage Grove who did that. And unfortunately, it failed in the Senate. But I think it's very significant that we got through the House, at least this time, a bill that was a tough vote to help out on that. And people in this area, I think, owe some thanks to some of those legislators who stuck their neck out, are going to probably get hit for some of it, may get hit for some of it in the next campaign. But we hope we can build on that in the future, because the point you raise is a good one, but I think we're getting beyond some of this regionalism that has been destructive in the past.
Question from the floor.
Thank you, Steve. Jerry Keene, a member of the City Club. I know as freshmen each of you fought pretty tough battles. I'm not sure any of the four of you were favored to win your race at the beginning of the primary process. Kelly's campaign is the one I'm most familiar with. Kelly, I know you in particular sweat blood during this campaign process. Despite all the money, it wasn't easy. I'm wondering, now it's all over, you've been through your first term, was it worth it? And what was your most rewarding moment, and what was your biggest disappointment?
We have 12 questions there altogether, so.
I start at least. I had, I guess, what was determined as an uphill battle because of party registration, and I ran on a basis of trying to be policy-oriented and not partisan, and hit that in my background pretty hard, and it was a tough campaign. Was it worth it? Absolutely. I think it was one of the most enjoyable and rewarding activities I've ever participated in.
Kelly?
There's no question in my mind that it was worth it, and that comes on top of, as Jerry mentioned, a 10-month campaign, where I was basically out of the law office for 10 months, and then a 7-month legislative session. I'm in a very, very different role at my law office than I was a year and a half ago, obviously. But it was worth it for the one and primary reason that, in my view, participatory democracy is the greatest experiment in the in Western civilization's history, and I feel privileged and honored to be an elected representative. And that sounds a little bit hokey, I suppose, and all that, but that's my heart's feeling. The downside comes on tensions and strains with family, job, income, those sorts of things. But the upside is to realize, like I say, that we're taking part in the greatest experiment in the history of the Western world.
Phil, if you'd like to include your most embarrassing moment in your answer, that'd be.
Oh, okay. That makes it 13 questions. Not only was it worth it, but it would have been worth it if I had gone through knocking on 12,000 doors and then would have ended up losing in November. It's an extraordinary experience going out and talking to people. They're friendlier than I thought they would be. They know the issues better than I thought. They don't have a whole lot of time for politics, many of them, but I think they're pretty reasonable people. And when we get a little afraid of votes that could get misconstrued, I think back on a lot of the people I met. Rewarding moment, we got funding for a youth conservation corps that also includes an Oregon Community Service Corps proposal that I probably wanted to have more than anything else. That was a tough fight. We had to fund it by raising the video game tax from $50 to $100. Sounds easy. It went down to the last day of the session, and it was 30 to 29 on the board when the votes came up, and the majority leader turned around to another member and said, "We need you on this one," and made it 31, and it passed. Depressing moment, probably the aspect of the tire and battery fee failing in the Senate, knowing that you'd asked people for their help on a tough vote, they'd given it to you, you'd taken them up the hill, you'd barely gotten over, and then for reasons that had little to do with the merits of the bill, it failed in the other chamber. I wrote a note to Steve about, he wanted questions we didn't want to ask, and I thought about the moment being ashamed of. I came in late one day from a Revenue Committee hearing, and there was a bill up on doing something about wood stove pollution that a member from Klamath Falls had worked on. He said, if I'd been smart, I would have just declared victory and gone home, but I think we need to do something about the problem. I came back in, and the bill was getting voted on. When it flashed up onto the screen, there were 13 aye votes for it. And at that point, I said, I voted for it in the committee, but what's the use? I mean, what's the use of getting hammered? And I'm going to get hammered for it along with everything else, and I was just kind of tired of it. And against my better judgment, I voted no. And about 15 minutes later, I came back on the floor, and I feel terrible about it. Because I saw that happen. I saw a lot of people change their votes to protect themselves, or not even vote the right way, what they thought was the right thing, because they were afraid of the flyer that's going to come out in October of 1990. And I was falling victim to that same kind of thinking on this particular vote. And I stood up again and I said, I'd like to change my vote to yes. Doesn't affect the outcome, but I feel a lot better about it. I thought I could get away with it with a minimum of embarrassment. Then the Speaker of the House, my former employer, said that, your conscience has gotten to you, Representative Keisling, which made my getaway a little more visible than I wanted it to be. But I did feel a heck of a lot better about it, even though it might cause some grief.
Beverly?
Yeah, when I decided to run for the legislature, I saw it as an experiment, because my basic philosophy in what I'm doing is that the way real change in society will occur is when many people get organized and demand changes of various sorts, and that having one person go to the legislature and sort of wave the flag and say, here's a good idea, it will not do it. And I felt encouraged that, in fact, there is a role for people in the legislature to help encourage that type of community organizing and involvement of community in issues. So I think I felt heartened by that, and it was worth it, and I want to do it again. On a personal level, I was very pleased to be able to bring the skills that I had developed over the years to bear on some issues I thought was important. In working on child care and on the Great Start and the Children's Agenda and the Intimidation Bill, I was able to bring together people, work out compromises, and think through what really made sense. And it was a very enjoyable and very intellectually stimulating activity. I think the place that was the hardest was to see how, especially in the House, that people were willing to erode people's civil rights in the interests of being tough on crime. And I'm certainly concerned about crime. I don't think there's anyone who isn't. But to make sort of votes that were basically just to look good and didn't really do anything, I found very discouraging and was very unhappy to find that there was only a small minority of us that were willing to vote against those types of bills.
Paul, do you have something you want to say?
Actually, I want a doctor. I learned a lesson here. Don't ever come up after a 12-part question. My name's Paul Romaine, City Club member. Everybody enjoyed the session so much. I'm really curious to find out just how quickly we're going to have another session. Workers' comp has been in the headlines. It took up a lot of time towards the end of the session, extended the session quite a bit. A lot wasn't done. A lot of ideas have been floating out there, and since the last person got to ask a blanket question, I demand the same right. What are the prospects for a special session dealing with the workers' comp issue?
Can we caucus on this one?
Well, I'll make a few brief comments on this. I have no inside information whatsoever. I would say that there may be all of about 4 members of 90 who truly understand the workers' compensation issue, and you're not looking at any of them before you today. It is one of the toughest issues down there. Obviously, we did not make much headway. Some of us are beginning to think that what we need to do, in a sense, is return to basics. I used to be a carpenter, and if you build a foundation that's out of square, what you find you do is you build the floors and the rooms and hang the windows and the doors, that everything is kind of out of kilter and it just builds on each other. I think we need to ask ourselves some basic questions about what our goals are, what the system ought to be doing. I'm not sure that the special session is the proper place for that. At the very least, we need to be giving it about as high visibility as we can during the interim. I think what will determine whether we need to go in special session is whether there's a crisis that comes about because of SAFE and the hemorrhaging of cash that's there. I don't see it right now, but that certainly could change based on that situation.
Tom?
Well, there's no question that you're not looking at the experts, but I don't think you need to know and understand the intricacies of that system to know that there's a major problem. SAFE is losing $1 million a week. The director of SAFE told us that if he was in business, he would probably just close the door. This is not to say that it's bankrupt. It's not to say that the claims will not be met for at least I'll call it the short distance future, 2 to 4 years, but it's a very troubling system. The premiums are high. The benefits to the workers are low. It's an incredibly complex problem with 6 or 7 major points of view that often conflict, and yet nothing could be hammered out even up to, I think it was about 11 p.m. on the last day of the session. 11 p.m. things were moving and finally collapsed. I don't have any inside information either. I believe something needs to be done. I don't think we can wait 2 years and then whatever we come up with begins to get implemented. I'm hoping that the governor will act. I'm hoping others will act to study the problem and work out some solutions in the next few months, and if necessary, call us back into special session and try to bring some resolution to SAFE's problems.
Kelly?
Phil and Tom both say they don't have any inside information. It sounds like my stockbroker. Tom said something that was important, and that has to do with the governor, because I think in a system that is so heavily, I won't say held hostage, but so heavily invested in by several major groups. I'm talking about healthcare providers, trial lawyers, chiropractors. All those folks have a very, very significant interest in what happens to the workers' compensation system. And when there's an issue like that and the system is so fundamentally broken, it seems to me that perhaps more than just legislative leadership is necessary. And this isn't a Goldschmidt bashing thing. It's not a Republican-Democrat thing, because there were several areas where the governor took a substantial leadership role. But he said before the session that this was not a priority for him. He was quoted in Oregon Business Magazine as saying that. And we all understand that priorities mean that some things aren't. And this was one that wasn't for him until late in the session, frankly, when the SAFE situation became so obviously bad, and he got involved too late. My guess is someone with Governor Goldschmidt's skills and abilities devotes the kind of energy that he could to this thing in 2 or 3, 4 months, pull all the players together, and you could probably have a package that could be meaningful reform through a special session. But it would take leadership from the governor's office.
Okay. We have time for one more question, and
I can just be really brief.
Go ahead.
I think there's a bigger picture to look at here in the workers' comp system, and that's the healthcare cost containment issue, which is beyond just workers' comp. And we did very, very little, frankly, in the legislature. And I'm hoping that the interim committee on healthcare will be able to make some progress on that in this session, as that will help address the workers' comp issue as well as some other pressing issues in the society.
Okay, one more question. We'll have to compress the question and answer into about 45 seconds. So,
okay, thank
good
you.
luck.
This is somewhat of a follow-up to Stan's earlier question, and anybody on the panel can address it. There seems to be a pervasive distrust of elected officials, and unfortunately, in my opinion, that's taken out in school levies votes. This legislature had the chance to directly attack the expenditure limitation, and yet they did not do that. They chose to step around it. How do you think the electorate feels about that? How do you feel about it personally, and what would any of you do about it in the next session?
I'm Phil Keisling. Quickly, I'm disappointed. I wish we had addressed it head on, and I wish we would have reformed it and changed it, because the limit that is now in the books that was written 10 years ago is wholly inadequate to the kind of needs that we face today. And I hope it is a discussion piece in the future, and we can come at it again in '91.
I advocated breaking the spending limit from the first day I got there, and there just wasn't the political will to do it. There are many needs that we have to address, and we need money to do it. And so I feel like this is something that's going to unfortunately follow us until we come to grips with that archaic spending limit that we have.
I think what Bev meant to say was there wasn't the political will to rewrite the spending limit, not break it, because we did break it to the tune of about $500 million, which was a 25% growth in the state general fund over the last session. And by anybody's standards, that's a huge growth in general fund government. The spending limit needs to be rewritten, but it needs to be rewritten in the interim when the question is not budget-driven. Because when everyone was talking about trying to rewrite it during the session, it was a question of how much money was going to squeak under the new spending limit. And that was skewing the policy debate. So the policy question needs to be resolved in the interim and not during the pace of a legislative session.
I'd like to thank the audience for its questions and the representatives for their time.